Okay, everyone, let's go ahead and get started.
Okay, I'll get started. Uh, Hi, I am Christina Greer. I'm an associate professor of political science at Fordham University, and we're going to have a conversation today sponsored by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And the title of our conversation today is We the People Protecting Our Vote in the Wake of COVID-19. So I'm here with my esteemed guest, Kristen Clark, President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Thanks, Kristen. We have Melanie Campbell, President and CEO of the National Coalition of Black Civic Participation. We have Carolyn DeWitt, President and Executive Director of Rock the Vote. Terry O. Minnis, Senior Director of Census and Voting Programs at Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And last but not least, Karen Hobart Flynn, President of Common Cause. Thank you all for being with me today. Throughout our conversation, I hope those of you who are watching will post your questions in the comments section at YouTube, and we'll hopefully get to them throughout the next hour. So I'm going to start off with some framing, and then hopefully we can have a robust conversation the next hour or so to help our viewers really understand what's at stake for not just this election, but for our larger democracy. We know that when we were, before we were social distancing and under this quasi quarantine, we're in the middle of a pretty robust primary season that unfortunately got cut short. But there were all these costs to voting that we saw across the country with people trying to participate. We have some open primaries, some closed primaries. There was some confusion as to who can participate. There's always some fear that's surrounding the actual voting process in this democracy. We have to remember that this is our second full election that we're going to the polls without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So not just the primary process, but moving into the general election. How do we think about exercising our right to vote? We know that Black women are always talked about as being the keepers of the Democratic Party and possibly all of democracy, depending on how they overperform at the ballot box. But I want us to have a conversation about how we can think about women of color in particular, Black women specifically, and some of the choices that will be made in these next few months, but also moving past November 3rd. And I also hope that we get to talk about some of the women who have run and women who are running in various offices across the country and how they're held to somewhat different and maybe even impossible standards. We see how Kamala Harris and Amy Klobuchar were sort of critiqued for some of their policies in ways that their male counterparts were not. We see that there are conversations about Stacey Abrams and qualifications where we know that there's never been a Black female elected governor in the history of our nation, and we've only had two Black female senators in the history of the country. So when we think about a pipeline, if we know that Asian Americans, Latinx Americans, Black Americans have been excluded over time, how do we put them in positions to even be in the conversation for the pipeline? We saw this with Elizabeth Warren with some unfair comparisons to Hillary Clinton, and how men are not compared in the same ways. And then I hope we get to this larger conversation about disenfranchisement. We definitely saw it in 2018 with the Georgia and Florida gubernatorial races, but we saw it again in 2020 in Milwaukee and parts of Wisconsin, where we went from 180 polling stations down to 5. We saw that in cities all across the nation in less popular ways. But what does that then mean when we think about defunding of the United States Postal Service and possibly voting by mail, and what that will mean for poorer communities, even if a postage stamp is given, and just the cost of educating oneself about our democracy. And especially in this post-COVID, or not even post-COVID, in this COVID space, if we are not post-COVID when we actually go to the polls, what does that mean for really upholding some of the principles that are in our Constitution, but for marginalized groups that you all work with across the country and have been for so long? How do we inspire young people to get active and stay active when we're campaigning for the first time, pretty much virtually and virtually only? How do we reach hard to reach populations that are oftentimes ignored in the campaign space? How do we meet them in a virtual space? So, Kristen, I think I want to start with you, please. And I want to talk a little bit about COVID-19, since that's clearly the reason why we're all on Zoom and not on a panel together, shoulder to shoulder. But how do you think the COVID-19 health crisis has really impacted the 2020 election cycle, and voting? And who do you think is most impacted by our current situation?
Yeah. Well, first, I want to thank all of our partner organizations for joining us today. Common Cause, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Rock the Vote, National Coalition on Black Civic Participation, organizations that are key to the success of election protection. And I think it's fair to say that the COVID pandemic has turned our work collectively on its head, and that all of us are figuring out how we can recalibrate our work so that we can have impact during a moment when the country is facing unprecedented challenges when it comes to accessing the ballot. I also just want to start off by, noting that there are a lot of communities reeling right now, that there are people dealing with loved ones who are hospitalized and quarantined, people who are dealing with the loss of loved ones. And in this context, it's really hard to, I think it's fair to say it's a little hard to get through to talk about kind of voting being really paramount at a time when people are frankly dealing with life and death issues that have hit their doorstep. The COVID pandemic is something that we, haven't experienced, I think, many of us in our lifetimes. People in New Orleans and the Gulf region lived through Hurricane Katrina, which definitely turned voting on its head and presented really significant challenges. But the pandemic, I think, is one of the biggest threats that we faced in modern time when it comes to accessing the ballot box. And the COVID pandemic is one that's hit African American communities and communities of color at really high rates. And so that definitely kind of shapes the backdrop in which we're doing this work right now. Through the election protection program, we have started to see up close and in a very direct way, the way that the pandemic is impairing access and making it harder for people to have vote. All of us, saw the grueling images of people standing in long lines waiting to cast their votes in Milwaukee and in Chicago. We saw Supreme Court interjecting itself at the 11th hour in the Wisconsin election, and in a way that definitely resulted in the disenfranchisement of voters. We saw the Ohio election rescheduled in a dramatic fashion, right? Like people literally woke up to the news, and only some people received that news, that the election had been postponed for a couple of weeks. So this is a really, really tough season. I think the most important theme is that voters need access to real-time, accurate information because the rules are changing every single day. And so one of the things that we do is we lead the election protection program. It's anchored by the 866 Our Vote hotline. And you've got legal volunteers who are working around the clock to impart accurate information to the public about the rules for voting in their state. So if you live in California, last week, there was a very significant development. Governor Newsom decided, and thankfully, to go on ahead and issue absentee ballots to every eligible voter in that state. That is tremendous and great news. But how do we break through while people are quarantined at home and get them the information that they need to make sure that they can vote in their state? So the 866 Our Vote hotline, I think, is a really important tool in this era. It is a number that I think folks should plug into their phones, disseminate to their network, share on social media, so that people have a place where they can get trusted, accurate information about how they can go about voting in their state. And the main thing, one of the main things that we're working to do is to make sure that people know how they can vote by mail in their state. And it's not easy in every state, which is why there's a fair amount of litigation right now that we and a number of other groups are mounting. But the 866 Our Vote hotline, I think, is one really important resource in this era.
Thanks, Kristen. And for those of you who are watching at home, please make sure you put some of your questions in the comments section, and hopefully we'll be able to get to them at the end. And so, Kristen, you make a really important point about this absentee ballot and voting by mail, because there is a lot of confusion. Even in New York, there was conversation about canceling our our April election, moving it to June, and then possibly canceling that. And so now we're implementing absentee ballot, but there's definitely some misinformation and some confusion amongst New Yorkers who want to participate, but aren't exactly sure how. So for those of you who are watching, real-time information, there's the 866 Our Vote hotline. And so, Melanie, I want to bring you in because Black women are consistently a major force when it comes to civic participation. And so, based on the work that you're doing with your organization, how are Black women activating in this moment of unprecedented crisis, essentially?
Thank you, Christina, and Kristen, thank you for the invitation. And it's just wonderful to see all these faces and sisters, on the front line. Black women, the reality is that, we're carrying a lot. When it comes to the Black vote, we know that we are the ones who not only show up, but we get our significant others and family members and everyone else to show up. I coined the phrase a long time ago, we are the secret sauce. If you need the Black vote, you better get the Black woman because of what we have to carry. We're heads of household. So many Black women are leading, including this organization we're sitting here hosting with, led by a Black woman over there with Kristen. Think about Cheryl and Eiffel with the LDF, and Judith Brown Deannis with the Advancement Project. So let's start with voting rights, right? As Black women holding it down. And knowing from whence I've been a part of the election protection since its beginning. We were part of that partnership that started it. So we've been holding it down and working in coalition, obviously across multiracial, multi-ethnic coalitions. The challenge that I'm seeing, we talk about civic participation, not just voting, but even in the census, right now, where people said, oh, the census is 60%, return rates is really great. But then when you look at these urban centers where you have large populations of African Americans and Black folks, it's not there. There is a sense of, with the COVID-19 that's on top of all of this, the realities that of how to change suspicions in our community about utilizing the mechanism of even absentee voting when the voter suppression has been so extreme the last decade, especially since President Obama was elected. There's a sense of concern. So when you look at people have they turn in your form, you don't have to put a postage stamp on it, right? But there's a sense of concern about, will I get counted? So there is a sense of concern that we're going to have to find ways, and as Kristen said, we're learning in a very unprecedented moment that we have to worry about how to get folks to believe that this system will work, i.e. absentee, i.e. vote by mail. One of the examples, though, I say ray of hope, led by a Black woman, P.D. Talley, who leads our Ohio Unity Coalition in Ohio. What they were able to do was partner up with groups, partner up with the faith community and others, and it's kind of testing out how do we do turnout in the midst of coronavirus when people have to worry about life and death, right? The fear of going out, with African Americans being impacted disproportionately when it comes to mortality, dying, right, at alarming rates. So they partnered up with churches and other groups and labor and other groups. Obviously election protection right there with us in that, and set up kiosks all over the state in key locations to try to test out some ways of people being able to go. There are people who are not going to fill out a form. They're going to want to show up and go to that polling place feeling that this is my way of knowing that my vote is more likely to get counted. So they set up these kiosks in different places where people could go and get the form, and they have no fault absentee in Ohio, fill it out, and then put it in another box in that same space where so you have control over your environment, 6 feet, the distance, and fill that out, put it in the box, and then groups come and pick them up and take them to the boards of elections. So trying to find unique ways of addressing it. And because there is so many, there's so much uncertainty, we're figuring it out. We're all trying to figure this out, right? I don't think it'd be hard to find somebody in the midst of what we've dealt with in the last 60 days that doesn't believe, there are a few, why elections matter, right? And why it's so important, because the policies impacting us, even in the coronavirus responses. You have a lot of family on a personal level. I'm from Florida. I have family in Florida and a whole lot of them in Georgia. And being able to try to explain to my family what to do when it comes to this is challenging in itself. So, and then you have so many Black women who are leading movements on the ground. I think about, the focus in the South was really, really, really critical in this election season as well. And this isn't, and a lot of lawyers on the phone, so y'all clean me up if I'm messing up, but I'm just calling it like I see it. When you look at these states that are led by certain party, and then moving it forward to make it harder for folks to protect themselves based on politics. Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. So all of the Black women that lead the work that we do at the National Coalition, all of our affiliates down there are led by Black women, right? So they're carrying that load. Right. We're talking about Sheila Tyson in Alabama and many, many others. So we're carrying it, and because we have to.
Right.
Well, thank you so much, Melanie. I mean, you brought up, will I get counted? And as someone who teaches young people in a collegiate setting, Carolyn, I want to pull you in, because that's a question that I hear from a slightly different angle. Not just will my physical ballot be counted, but I hear from a lot of young people, it's like, well, I mean, will my actual vote count? Doesn't really matter. It seems like, the system's already decided. They oftentimes use the word rigged, especially in a primary space, but definitely in a general space. They're not really making this connection between the power of their vote as an 18 to 21-year-old and the larger electoral process. And so can you talk to us about some of the issues that young voters have faced already during this election cycle? How do you think they're being impacted by some of these college campus closures, and possibly in the fall when many colleges either will not be able to hold in-person classes, or certain students will choose to stay home and learn from the comforts of their parents' bedrooms? And then what are some of the creative strategies that Rock the Vote is working on this season to make sure we don't lose that really important age group in such an important national election?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you to Kristen and Lawyers Committee and Dr. Greer for you being here, and all the colleagues. Very honored to be here and have this important conversation. We often hear, does my vote even count, or it doesn't matter? And so much of that comes back to education and civic education, really. And us as a country doing very little to prepare young voters to participate and to understand their place in our democracy and the importance of their voice. That is a challenge we are going to very much have to face, not just in the short term for this election, but it is a much longer term conversation that we need to be having and changes that need to be made. As far as what we've seen this spring, with college campuses closing, we saw over 25 million students that were displaced as a result of evacuations that happened. Students had to, in many cases, had to find housing in very short order. We know a lot of students, particularly from low income backgrounds, do not have the support of their families. They don't have somewhere to go back to. So we know of some students, including some of our ambassador program, who are still looking for stable housing. So what you have there are two things. One, with regard to the primary season and having their voice heard in the primaries, it's very much impacted their ability to, whether they're registered at their college address and then they moved and not being able to participate in the new location where they are because primaries have passed or because they missed deadlines. But there are also, the reality is, they're focused on more immediate basic needs, like a lot of Americans are right now. But they're, young people are at such a transitory point in their lives, whether they're transitioning from high school to college, they don't know where they're going to be, whether they're transitioning and not going out into college, but into the job force. And now, they're entering an economy that's going to be extremely difficult to move into. And where do they get healthcare, and all of these really important questions. And so in addition to that, in normal times, it is, young voters are new voters, and so they're unfamiliar with this process. And so we come back to this idea that there's a lot of education we have to do to move a young new voter to cast a ballot. What we do at Rock the Vote is to make sure that we're, getting them registered, but then walking them step by step through that process. So, doing research on their ballot, knowing where their polling location is, making sure they're not missing a deadline to request their absentee ballot, knowing what that process is. And so, for young people in particular, that's important even more so because we've seen so many laws in the last few years pop up, whether it's voter ID laws or proof of residency laws that are designed to keep them from participating in the process. But, on top of that, nothing's normal about what we're facing today. And so the challenge to prepare young voters is made worse by the confusion caused by coronavirus and by the uncertainties of what the situation is going to be in the fall. So what we are doing kind of to be proactive is to, we have advocacy efforts at both the federal and state levels. This is not going to be a single approach. This is going to be collaboration with some election, administrators. It's going to be policy changes. It's going to be litigation. It's going to be direct voter outreach and education and mobilization. As Melanie was talking about, there's a huge amount of relational organizing that we have to be doing. And young people actually can be that force in their families a lot of times because so much is happening online and happening through phones and happening digitally that, may not be very accessible to older populations as well. They may not know where to look for the information. So in addition to that, we'll be running an effort to also recruit poll workers because we know that we need to keep at least some, we need to keep polling locations open in addition to absentee ballot pushes. We know that 2016, we had 60% of poll workers were over the age of 60. So we need to have a huge effort to recruit young people to be poll workers. A lot of things that people don't know about Rock the Vote, we actually power over 1,100 organizations, online voter registration efforts. We're building the same thing for absentee ballot requests as well. And anyone who enrolls in those, we actually then sign them up for election reminders through SMS and emails that customize based on their location when deadlines, dates are happening, any last minute changes. So they get a text message knowing actually your ballot's going to be mailed to you, which is really helpful for that real-time information. So those are just a few of the things that we're working on.
Great, thank you so much. So just as a reminder to those who are watching, please type in any questions you may have for my panelists in the comments section. Hopefully we'll get to them. And don't forget that if you're looking for real-time voter information, you can go to 866-OUR-VOTE, which is the hotline, which will hopefully give you accurate and up-to-date information on the voting process. So Terry, I want to bring you in now because we've mentioned vote by mail, and for some it's a solution for many voting advocates And that's what they're pushing for right now. So are there any concerns you have when it comes to language access and some of the unique issues faced by voters who need language assistance to cast an effective ballot?
Well, thank you very much for the question. And thank you, of course, to Kristen and Lawyers Committee for the invitation. I am very honored and pleased to be on this panel with so many well respected and accomplished women. And so to get to the question, I think it's interesting because voting by mail can actually be a useful solution for voters who have language assistance needs. But really, it has to be one of the ways in which someone can vote and not the only way, right? And I think that's one of the concerns about how some advocates are talking about vote by mail, because we do know that voting by mail can provide voters with language assistance need maybe more time for them to be able to process and participate and fill out their ballots. It can allow them to receive assistance from others with understanding the ballots without actually having to coordinate schedules to have them go with them to a polling place, and really can be an empowering choice for a voter to decide that they want to vote by mail or utilize the absentee voting process to allow them to make an effective and informed choice. At the same time, I think it's very clear to us that having the option to vote in person, as Carolyn just mentioned, especially in jurisdictions that are required to provide language assistance by law, that it's really critical to have those options to vote in person. Because it really provides opportunities for the voters to receive language assistance from a multilingual poll worker who will have been trained to provide such assistance and trained on the rules with respect to election and so forth. So I think one of the things that we've certainly been looking at during this crisis is making sure that any solutions on how to effectively and safely run elections during the pandemic actually include safe and efficient in-person voting opportunities, in addition to mail solutions. And in addition, with respect to voting by mail or communicating with voters or registered voters by mail, really making sure that that process also includes providing information in accessible ways for voters with language needs. So one example, of course, would be, just as Kristen had mentioned earlier, with respect to proactively mailing ballots, for example, to all registered voters, as California just announced they would do. It's making sure that they also include in-language materials that provide the same information, that provide the same access to participating, right? In California, there are plenty of jurisdictions that are required to provide language assistance in a multitude of different languages, including Spanish and many Asian languages. And so making sure that those voters get their language assistance and get their materials in language is critical. So also, I think one thing that Carolyn mentioned that also sort of connected with sort of how I feel about voters with language assistance need is that this may very well be the first election in which they'll be voting, right? So they are oftentimes new voters. And as many have already mentioned, the confusion that is surrounding our elections process generally has only been heightened during this time, right? And so proper and effective communication will be critical in ensuring that we don't leave behind those that have been historically marginalized and disenfranchised. And I mean, people absolutely need access to real-time information, not just in English, but in language, particularly because, it's going to be all that more confusing for voters with language assistance needs. And then finally, I just wanted to also mention, as part of the Election Protection Hotline Suite of Advancing Justice, AAJC, in conjunction with API Vote, we run an Asian language hotline, 888 API Vote. We provide assistance in English and 8 Asian languages. And so we also hope to be a good resource for people that have questions and concerns about, how to effectively participate during this election season.
Great. Thank you so much, Terry. That's 888 API Vote for people who need assistance in, you said 8 languages?
8 Asian languages, yeah.
8 Asian languages. Okay, so we'll make sure that we continue to let our readers or our viewers know that. And last but not least is Karen. So you lead Common Cause, an organization with offices across the country. I'm very familiar with your New York office and Susan Lerner.
Oh, okay.
so fantastic and what she's doing to help protect us. I mean, we're a blue state, but we can be a little shaky every now and again if we're not careful. And so much of your organization and your organizing has been on the ground level. And so can you talk to us a little bit about how you've had to move off of the streets and organizing on the streets with people largely confined to their homes, and what impact this has had on your work and your organization and your organizing?
Sure. First, thank you, Christina, for the question, and thank you, Kristen, for bringing us together. And it's an honor to be here with Melanie and Terry and Carolyn, who are amazing leaders in the election space. Without a doubt, the way people are engaging has changed because of the COVID pandemic, and also the way we organize has got to change in order to engage them in the fights that matter. So we have staff all over the country and actually have been active users of Zoom and webinars, much like what we're using today. And so we have used it to reach out to activists, to engage them, educate them about issues, primarily at this point on voting, and also engaging those activists in critical fights. So whether it is fighting for resources through the CARES Act 1 or 2, the stimulus package that provides resources to states to make the changes they need to both make voting more accessible through vote by mail, absentee voting, online voter registration, and also ensuring, as Terry talks about, safe in-person voting. So, early voting can help clear out so you don't have the long lines and protections. We want to make sure that voting is in places that are safe for people to go to, not in retirement centers that could infect other people. So we've engaged probably in the last 2 months, done training with about 20,000 activists in varieties of fights, including funding for the post office, as one person mentioned. We've also created action teams state by state to engage in the fights that are happening on the ground. We've moved to phone banking and peer-to-peer texting, which can make a real difference in the election protection space. So I'll talk about that in 1 minute. We've also seen unprecedented activism from our members, but also from coalition allies. I know that more than 100,000 people have signed a petition calling on their elected official to fund the US Post Office, to fight for stimulus funding, but also fight at the state level. For example, in Missouri, there is an effort to undo some important gerrymandering reform in Missouri. As one of the groups that participates in the Election Protection Coalition, we help coordinate, recruit, and train and help place thousands of on-the-ground poll monitors to assist voters on election day. They're sort of the first line of defense, and we train our volunteers to look for problems at voting locations for issues like equipment malfunctions, misinformed poll workers, voter intimidation. And so we flag those issues and send them back to the hotline or deal with election officials on the ground. When COVID started to escalate, we were working for primaries, the Ohio primary and Florida on March 17th. And as you heard, Ohio was canceled in the middle of the night. And in Florida, we had recruited poll workers, or poll monitors rather, to be on the ground to deal with these problems. We did not want any of our folks to be going out there at the height of the COVID pandemic. And so actually, we switched to roving monitors who drove in their cars and went and checked in on polling places. And they looked for a number of problems. If there were long lines, if a precinct was closed, some of them would have signs, others did not. So we would make sure that voters there knew where they needed to go. We would look for signs of people intimidating or misinforming voters. These are the kinds of things that happen all the time. And so doing that, they also brought with them the 866 Our Vote election sign so that people knew where to call if they had problems. They had palm cards and other information for voters as sort of know your rights cards. So moving to the roving monitors made a lot of sense and also kept our volunteers safe. The other thing is we also did virtual election monitoring. So that is recruiting volunteers to be looking at social media and websites for their local newspaper, local journalists, and their Twitter accounts to see what kind of problems came up. The Twitter feed of the county supervisor of elections, other county government and city government officials to look for problems that would crop up. Again, moving into the problem solving mode and then connecting them to the hotline if they had problems. In Ohio, as you know, the primary was canceled, and actually the legislature moved to have the primary on April 27th. Unfortunately, they closed most in-person polling places and moved to casting ballots on mail with their antiquated system, where they really weren't equipped to be dealing with the kind of problems. So they were swamped with the request for absentee ballots, in part because you had to ask via mail for a ballot and then fill it out and send it back in, which is, just crazy when we should have an ability to do this online, to request absentee ballots. And so we had both election officials that were swamped, service was slow from the post office, and it led to delay and thousands of people whose votes weren't counted.
Right.
And so our coalition worked to recruit and train 400 volunteers to participate in a peer-to-peer texting program, so that we were notifying people about how they could get their absentee ballots, and also working to check with them to see if they had gotten those in. So using that kind of system and webinars to do 8 trainings for these volunteers is a new way to engage. And finally, we're recruiting for the field program for November. And right now we're looking at in-vehicle poll monitoring and social media monitoring for disinformation or problems that crop up. But we don't know what's going to happen in November. So we're recruiting volunteers, and we may need to pivot to do more work on the ground if it is safe for people to vote in November.
Thanks so much, Karen. So I want to bring all of you in here now, because based on, Karen kind of laid out what they're doing. And I wanted to know, how do we get people excited about voting whilst thinking about all the sort of pandemic, everything that's involved in the pandemic that's surrounding them during this time of crisis? And how do we get people to focus on voting? And what are you all doing in your various organizations to help people sort of, Kristen, you started off sort of saying, we're dealing with literally life and death, but we can't ignore voting whilst also in the midst of this crisis and this pandemic. So I guess I'll start with you, and then feel free for you all to jump in. But how do we focus, really?
Yeah, it's so hard, but I think the experience from Hurricane Katrina is instructive.
Mm-hmm.
Hurricane Katrina hits, you have a city where people are mass displaced. They are forced to go and live in Atlanta and Houston and Mississippi and Alabama, and they all are desperately trying to get home. And there are important elections happening that determine who's going to be at the table at the city level, at the state level. And I remember doing work in Louisiana at that time, and it was a struggle to figure out how do we safeguard voting rights in that context. And I'll tell you, people who were displaced cared about who was going to go to bat for them. They cared about who was going to work to forge their path, their road home. And I remember some people got on buses from other cities out of state to come back in. But I remember we also had to fight to get the state to really relax deadlines so that people could vote by absentee ballot. In times of crisis, our votes really matter. And I think that the pandemic is that moment times 100. It really matters who's going to be sitting in Congress, who's going to be sitting in the state legislature, who's going to be your governor, really helping us figure out how we climb out of this deep hole that we're in because of the pandemic. The pandemic has ripped the Band-Aid off and revealed the systemic racism and discrimination that infects virtually every area of life, that has left communities of color particularly vulnerable at this moment. And to me, there is a way to thread a needle and tie kind of what we are experiencing as a country right now with this pandemic to a conversation about why voting matters. I also think it's important to remember a lot of the closely contested elections that we've lived through in recent time. Elections that, there was an election in Virginia that came down to a coin toss. There have elections that have come down to a couple dozen, a couple hundred votes. So this myth that people's singular vote is without value, I think is one that we have to crush. I think we have to get people to, remember that every vote really does count. And one bitter reminder of the power of our individual votes is the fact that voter suppression is alive and well. There would not be people out there fighting to silence us and pushing these dangerous tactics to keep us locked out of the ballot box if it were the case that our singular votes didn't matter. They do. It's why there's relentless voter suppression. And the pandemic, I think, is just another reminder about kind of the power of our voices and why we have to use it at this moment.
Well, does anyone else want to weigh in or?
Yeah, if I may, I think just to build off of what Kristen said, and something that Melanie had said earlier, and Carolyn and Karen and everybody, I think for me, what's interesting about the pandemic is that it is really a stark example of why who's in power matters, right? And I think that, it's not a new tactic by any means, trying to connect the dots for folks to kind of show how, voting puts people in power make policies, make laws, makes decisions that impact us. But I think that, with respect to what's happening during the pandemic, that perhaps it's an opportunity to really have those stark lines connecting the dots for folks, certainly, within certain Asian American communities that maybe had some more conservative leanings, seeing what's happening within the immigration front is something that could maybe help open some eyes. And you may not be able to help everyone see that, but you can help start to draw those connections of why it matters, why you can't just be perhaps focused on one single issue, or why it really matters and what it means, right, to have people speaking for you as a representative. And so I think that that's just something that we can all work together on. And for some organizations, it's going to be trickier because of tax status, right, and what you can and can't do. So I just feel like, we can all work together and people can pick up the different pieces and kind of help lay out that narrative so that when it's all woven together, we are really helping to push that movement of having our communities, have their voices heard.
And so, Terry, just expanding on that, because Melanie, I definitely want to bring you in. We're talking a lot about voting, but Melanie, can you also just talk to us a little bit more about registration? Because, we're one of the few democracies that make it a very difficult two-stage process. And, we know that there are certain states that make it a little easier for you to do same-day registration and voting, but most places, it's actually quite difficult. So can you sort of zoom out 30,000 feet and kind of, talk to us about some of either the concerns you have or some of the opportunities you see for this voting and registration conversation?
And I'll try to be brief because I know the time is tick-tocking away. I think it's both, right? You have these opportunities and you have the challenges, right? So I'm going to speak a little bit about the opportunities because part of the what we've had to weave into all of this work is to also meet our folks where they are, primarily online for those who are able to shelter in place. Not everybody can, right? So that reality is also there. But with our young people, for example, we work with Rock the Vote, partner with them and Lawyers Committee and many other folks around utilizing technology. So trying to find creative ways. So our young people created a TikTok, right? To get folks to, and I did not know what a TikTok was, but I know now, right? But to utilize a TikTok, which is usually for entertainment purposes, to create a piece on why it's important to be counted, but also building in that there's a lot of anxiety out here. So when we're out here doing this work, we also have to find out hey, how you doing, right? So even doing check-ins when we're doing the work, because people are having a lot of anxiety, fear, anger, frustration, right? Finding ways to what just happened down there in Brunswick, Georgia, right? With the young man being killed by whoever these folks call themselves being, right? But how to even organize around that, right? Being able to, for folks to be able to say, hey, we got to find ways to fight, but also figure out ways to address folks' real fears and concerns that are out here, and tying that to the vote, right? Tying that to, so folks are having, utilizing comedy, right? So there's a lot of testing going on, but it's also a lot of things that we have to do with all this technology that's out there, and simultaneously dealing with the voter suppression that happens online. So there's a lot of barriers that are out there. It was there beforehand, before Corona, when it comes to misinformation, disinformation. So having to utilize a platform that was also a new space for voter suppression, that we definitely know what happened in 2016 and what's still happening right now, which is why election protection is so important. To be able to provide information, so folks are having to utilize these platforms. So there's all these barriers, but there's also these opportunities, and being able to be flexible in how we're organizing is really, really critical. So what we're focused around is, yes, utilizing technology, but also, as I mentioned, PD Tally in Ohio, right, found a way for folks who are afraid to use the technology, right, afraid to utilize what may be out there, to also find ways to find some unique, old-fashioned, I want to go out here and fill out this form.
Right.
We've got to be creative, and we've got to work in coalition, right? And that's so critical, because it is unprecedented. You know, we don't know what it's going to look like. We have another opportunity, June, right, around the corner, where Georgia and other places, several places are going to have voting going on. We've got to work even closer, I believe, because the people also, especially you get over the fear and the distrust. Trusted messengers are critical and vital.
Yeah. And that's what I want to pull in the others, because we have quite a few audience questions about just that very fear and distrust that you've been talking about, Melanie. And so one of the questions from our audience is, what can states do to be ready to have mail-in, absentee, paper ballots, and or enough polling stations in place by November?
Yeah.
Karen?
If I could, just a couple things. One is, and it really ties to both what Kristen was talking about, what Terry was talking about, and Melanie. You know, in a lot of ways, there is an opportunity right now, and many of our groups working in broad coalitions are working with election officials to move reforms to make voting more accessible. So, and it is the technology. 38 states have online voter registration. So people can register to vote from the safety of their own home. There are packages of reforms that people are looking at, and it has to be narrowly tailored state by state, because not everybody has California that can move to full vote by mail. New York, 3% of their ballots came in absentee ballots. So they are not quite in the same place California is. So what can we look at in the structure to make it safer, which I think is an important piece. When people understand why it's important to vote, but they're going to worry about their safety. So if we can expand options, that means fewer people are going in person. It creates a safer space for those people who are not serviced by mail, who need to be able to go and vote in person, people with disabilities. You see Native Americans that are not serviced well by the postal office. So one, technology and removing those reforms now can make a difference. It also makes a difference on the voter registration side, because we also have automatic voter registration. These are reforms that have been moving for the last decade, state by state, and we are learning from each other. And so automatic voter registration, same day, that's a safety net for people. All of those pieces really matter.
Mm-hmm. Carolyn, you alluded to this before, but is there something that you're specifically thinking about when it comes to some of the states that can be ready to have mail-in, absentee, paper ballot, and enough polling places in November for the population, the young people that you're working with and working
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, building on what Karen and everyone else has said, this is a state by state approach, right? We have an opportunity right now. A lot of us have been pushing to make our election system and processes more resilient, but right now it's required, right? And approaching it state by state is going to be really important because we have to meet the state where they are and what they're capable of doing. There are ways to scale a lot of these efforts like vote by mail, but the reality is by the time some of them states make these decisions, it might be a little too late, to be honest, to do it effectively. And so, when we talk about voter registration, when we talk about all these efforts, one thing to keep in mind is the critical key point are third parties who are doing these efforts, right? It's not the Secretary of State or the state election director who, they don't have a marketing budget to go and reach marginalized communities and talk to each voter. That's unfortunately, we haven't invested in our elections the way we need to. So it's up to state groups, local groups, national groups. And so we need to make sure that the technology that we're using, quite frankly, is as seamless as possible. So for instance, voter registration efforts, we work with state election officials to make sure that if they have online voter registration, that it is a seamless process. So that's what we do state by state. And to try and break down the steps for an individual to register to vote online. For those states where there's not online voter registration, we're actually augmenting our platform, which will not just affect Rock the Vote, but all of the partners who use our technology, so that we're either mailing a pre-populated form that someone has filled out online. So we're mailing that form to the registrant, or we're actually asking them for their digital signature where we can. We're affixing it to their form and we're mailing it in for them. And then it's a very similar process state by state on the absentee ballot request effort as well, where we will have to look at how each state is handling this and what's required, whether it's a digital signature, a form, excuse, and then we'll have to educate the voters based on what their state and local policies are.
Right. Well, unfortunately, we only have time for one more question. And so I'm going to ask each of you to sort of answer it relatively briefly because an hour has flown by. But I think I'll start with, even though Kristen started us off, Melanie, I want to start with you on this question. And then we'll sort of go around in a brief circle. But the question is, women leaders are front and center and have been front and center during this conversation in many contexts. How have you been inspired by women leaders in the wake of COVID-19? And how are women leaders showing up differently during this moment of crisis? So I'm going to ask each of you to just give me like 30 seconds, minute max, of how you see women showing up very differently and very specifically in this particular moment. So Melanie, I'll let you get us started.
Quickly. We're the influencers. I can speak for all women. I can speak for Black women, with Black women. We are the influencers. And so we have that ability to get our folks to do what they need to do. Our children, our significant others, our community. So we're just owning that power and pushing the envelope with candidates as well, to understand that if you want to win, you need to, follow Black women.
Mm-hmm. Terry, what do you think?
I think Melanie's completely right. And I think that, women, not just in sort of the external spaces, but also internal with families, with, I know Melanie had talked about being the one to help encourage different people within the family to participate. I think that is certainly so true. And it's going to be so much even more important during this time.
Carolyn?
I'll echo both Melanie and Terry, but, add to it that I think, women who are running organizations are coming together in coalition. And the only way that a lot of this is going to be done, to be no one organization, no one elected official, it is going to take many of us coming together. And I think women have that perspective a lot of times of working together.
Karen?
So, I agree with everyone. It's also some Michelle Obama is coming forward when we all vote. You see Stacey Abrams with their Fair Fight. I'm gonna raise other women secretaries of state. Actually, one that I think is interesting is Secretary of State Kim Wyman from Washington State, a Republican, who has been making the circuit talking about how vote by mail, there's no fraud, as some Republicans are saying, or, you know, and there are safeguards you can put in place for the tiny little episodes that you may see, and that it is a very powerful tool, especially at a time like now. Jocelyn Benson in Michigan, who has also helped to put in place some reforms around the signature match requirement around absentee ballots, because those have been a real method of vote suppression.
Okay, thanks, Karen. And Kristen?
You know, I think about the women who are leading the charge in Atlanta and Chicago and San Francisco, and they are a tremendous source of inspiration right now. I think about the women on this lineup right here on this panel who are all leading the charge in you know, different ways, but all to, you know, we're all kind of moving towards the same end goal of making sure that everyone has voice in our democracy in 2020. I think about the mothers. It's a great question to ask on the heels of Mother's Day, who are holding it down and juggling work responsibilities and taking care of you know, kids who are distance learning. You know, they're women who are just doing an amazing job right now holding it down. And I'm just thrilled to be a part of this lineup and to be in the trenches with all of the women doing this work right now. We're using litigation, we're using the power of advocacy, grassroots work. We're lobbying Capitol Hill for change and funding needed for the US Postal Service and so much more, and really bringing up the three-dimensional strategy that's needed to make sure that people can vote in 2020. So thanks to all of you.
Well, I want to thank all of you, not just for today's call, but for the real dedication and the hard work that you all bring every single day. I also want to just remind our viewers that if you're looking for real-time information about your voting process, you should go to 866-OUR-VOTE. That's a hotline that will help promote election protection. So that's 866-OUR-VOTE. And also, if you're looking for assistance in Asian American languages, that's 888-API-VOTE. That's 888-API-VOTE, and that's for assistance in Asian language. So I have the pleasure of spending a Monday with Kristen Clark from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, Melanie Campbell from the National Coalition of Black Civic Participation, Carolyn DeWitt from Rock the Vote, Terry L. Minnis from Census and Voting Programs at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and Karen Hobart Flynn from Common Cause. And so last but definitely not least, I'm going to bring Marcia Johnson Blanco to close this out with a few words. Thanks for joining us, Marcia.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. And I thank all of you for just what has been an excellent and wonderful conversation. I oversee the Voting Rights Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, including election protection, and work with this group of exceptional women that you heard from today to ensure that the right to vote from for all voters is protected. Since 2001, election protection has been at the forefront of providing information and assistance to voters. As you've heard today, it's our goal to ensure that everyone can cast a ballot and to ensure that that ballot counts. And as you heard, we not only have a suite of voter protection hotlines, but we have on the ground polling place monitoring and voter education. And when necessary, we do litigate, including on election day. And this Election Protection Coalition meets regularly to coordinate our collective efforts, because it's important that we ensure that we extend our reach as widely as possible to address the challenges voters are facing today. And you've heard, you know, this is an unprecedented election cycle where when we vote, where we vote, the rules are changing all the time. And what hasn't changed with election protection is the hundreds of organizations, including those you heard from today, who continue to join together to protect the right to vote. In our democracy, the right to vote is sacrosanct. As the Supreme Court noted in 1963, the right to vote is preservative of all other rights. And this applies to every issue that you all care about. So our participation in our elections is essential. And we, as you've heard, welcome you to call the 866-OUR-VOTE hotline for assistance from trained volunteers. There's the 866-OURVOTE.org website. Follow 866-OUR-VOTE on social media. And please vote. Our democracy, our nation needs your voice. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you all for joining us today. Thanks for tuning in. Be safe.